Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So here we go. I actually started the live stream about 10 seconds ago, and I didn't press the live button. But I'm live now, and I think you can all hear me. So give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, and tell me that you, because I'm using a different software to the normal one. So let me know if everything's okay. If there's any problems, let me know, guys. So tonight's live stream will be a little bit different to the usual chit chat with me, general questions with me, and hopefully there's going to be no kids interrupting as well tonight. So what it's going to be is we've got a soil consultant from the States over tonight, joining us tonight. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about what he does. He's going to tell us a little bit about what he does, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how we should be preparing our gardens over winter and what we should be doing for the soil, so we can have a productive year next year. And then once we get to that point, he'll tell us. He'll talk to us. Ask him a few questions. He'll answer those for about half an hour, and then about 8:30, what we'll do is we'll open up the floor for questions. So you guys fire away with any questions, and try and capitalize them so I can see them quite clearly. So it just makes it a little bit easier for me. And before I introduce our guest, I just want to say hello to everyone in. So we've got you in the house. Emma Jones, you came in live stream and you've already dropped a super sticker. Thank you very much for that. Very kind of you. Davey, how are you doing? Thank you very much for coming in. Pound for Pound TV. Frank, Isabel, how are you guys all doing? Thank you very much for coming in. So without any further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our guest, Ian Potoski, from the States. Here we go. Let's get him up on the screen and let's get him speaking. So Ian,
hello.
Thanks very much for joining us tonight. It's a real honor to have you here. So you're based out on the field at the moment, working with people, teaching them how to work on the soil and how to improve the soil. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, your qualifications, and what you're doing, and maybe some of the projects that you've worked on?
Sure, of course. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this opportunity, and hello, everyone. Well, so a little bit about me. Well, you wouldn't get by the dress attire, but I'm originally from Long Island, New York, and I have lived all over the country. And well, just a little bit, I started out growing microgreens, right? Because America is just really starting to wake up to microgreens while the rest of the world were out there being much more advanced than us in the field of agriculture. So I started getting in that industry. And in my time growing these microgreens, I had a few colleagues within the realm of soil science who were telling me, hey, are you raising Hybrix microgreens? Because we'd be very interested in that experiment. I says, Hybrix what? I says, I know what microgreens are. What's Brix? And so they explained to me. So Brix is the sugar in the plant sap, and it's what carries all the vital mineral nutrients that your body needs. And so I wanted to take this time to really study up on Brix, understand how it functions, and how to raise nutrient-dense produce through this method. And that led me down a rabbit trail of studying permaculture. So I studied permaculture under Dr. Elaine Ingham, Dr. Matt Powers, Jeff Lawton, what's his name, Michael Whitman, and several others that have been in the permaculture movement. That would later translate over to my coming across someone who studied RBTI. RBTI stands for the Reams Biological Theory of Ionization. And Dr. Reams was an Einstein-level genius who was actually best friends with Dr. Albert Einstein. And his work actually showed us how all biological life comes together, okay? And if we can understand that blueprint, then we can understand how to best take care of our land, of ourselves, of our animals through that process. So studying under these doctors allowed me the opportunity to show others how they can grow Hybrix produce. how they can have a better year of crops year after year, how to get away from the chemicals that are killing us today, and how to go back to a biology-based system. And that biology, talking about the soil food web, really comes from Dr. Elaine Ingham's work. And when we understand the advantages of prepping our gardens through a biology-based system, then we can begin to understand how we can have this like awesome, super nutritionally dense foods that last much longer than anything you buy at a grocery store. You don't have to worry about spoiling nearly as quickly, and you know that everything you're eating is clean. You know it's good for you, and you know where it's coming from. There's no more mystery of, is this really organic, or am I just hearing that it's organic?
I mean, that's one of the big reasons that when we moved to the house that we're in now, is we started gardening because I wanted my children to know where their food came from. I wanted them to have that contact with their food, and it's something that it seems like a lot of people are starting to, there's a big disconnect between people and where the food comes from. I remember speaking to people and they didn't realize that eggs came from chickens.
Yes.
Or milk came from cows, and these kind of things. And so it's really important to try and build that connection back with people to the soil. So that being said, what should we be doing right now with our gardens? A lot of us have, for a lot of us, especially the northern hemisphere, our gardens are pretty much empty. The gardening season's almost over. What should we be doing right now to try and build our garden soil structure, soil life, soil fertility for next year?
Great question. And I love this question because a lot of people, especially here in the States, a lot of what I hear is, oh, it's winter time, gardening season is over, and they do nothing with their beds. Like, but you have to. Don't let it just sit there. And so one of the many things that I strongly recommend that be done is build up the organic matter in your garden beds. And if you live in a wooded area or any place where you can get forest debris is going to consist of many different leaf varieties of different trees. It's going to consist of pine needles and pine cones and anything else, including little twigs. These are all great things because the idea is to mimic nature. Now, I've had people say, well, wait a minute. I can't put pine needles and pine cones in my bed because if I do that, it's going to change my soil to be more acidic. That is not actually true. If your forest debris is dominantly pine needles or pine cones, then yes, it can slightly make your soil a little more acidic. But in my experience, most soils today have a pH that it tends to be more alkaline to begin with. And so having that adjustment in the pH is not necessarily a bad thing. It will benefit your soil. So you could do, generally my process, what I like to share with people is get biochar put down on your beds. So after you've aerated your soil, and the way I would do that, I would get like a broad fork or a, what do they call it? A pitchfork, just a regular old pitchfork, and just gently lift that earth up. We don't do tilling. You don't want to till your land because every time you till, you end up killing a lot of that biology. You release the nitrogen that's in that soil, and you also release large amounts of carbon composites that sit in the soil. So it's better to aerate the soil with a broad fork or a pitchfork. You can lift that earth up gently, just let it breathe a little bit, help out the soil biology. Then,
so just rock it back and forward, just so you crack the earth, so you just release some of that compaction. Yeah.
That's exactly it. Give it a good old rock, and you do this like every foot. So put in your hole, rock it back a little bit, lift that earth a little bit, go back a foot, do the same thing, and do that all the way down your bed. Broad forks will make the job go a lot faster. So you're talking about a lot of manual labor, but it's really worth it because you're building your community of soil biology. Then you can put down your biochar. Biochar is made from wood of any kind of variety. Hardwood deciduous trees are usually better because it will last longer. But in the molecular structure of that biochar, it creates like a honeycomb-like shape. And that shape becomes a house for the bacteria. And the bacteria will go into that house and begin to proliferate very quickly. So you can vastly increase your soil biology this way. It can hold 7 times its weight in carbon, as well as 6 to 7 times its own weight in water. So it's a great source of water retention, okay? A great source of carbon. So then you would want to put down EM, effective microbes, add more microbiology to that soil. Then you can put down fresh grass clippings or any grass clippings that you can find. Even if you were to use straw bales or hay bales, you can do a layer of that across the garden, and then do a layer of your forage debris. The reason we're doing these layers is because we're trying to put the carbon back into that soil. We're trying to put nitrogen back into the soil, but that layer acts as a blanket, and it can help to keep that soil warmer throughout the winter season, no matter your region. And that will allow for your bacteria to further propagate and dominate that soil. And this is a good way to build some very, very fertile land.
I mean, what you were saying there, there's a couple of things that I want to pick up on. There's one where you're talking about pine needles introducing some level of acidity. That's a short-term thing. So in the long term, those pine needles would revert back to neutral or close to neutral anyway. But where we're talking about pH, and we're just talking about, something on a chemical, but basically a chemistry measure. Where is the thinking on soil pH and how it impacts plant life at the moment?
Yeah, so pH is really important because a lot of times you'll get caught up in what I like to call the pH game. And what that looks like is you'll have experts coming in there say, well, your okra needs to have a pH of 7.0, and your tomato plants need to have a pH of like 6.4. None of that's true. All biological life does best on a pH reading of 6.4. The reason for that is because pH it's a lot more than just a measurement of or concentration of hydrogen. When you get to break down the molecular chemical science of it, it's a measurement of resistance and electrical current. And we can measure that with instruments. So all the mineral nutrients that you have in your garden bed have to be able to they have to flow on this electrical current speed at a certain speed in order for it to be available to the plants. What I mean by that is this. Think of pH as like a speedometer for your car, okay? There is a electrical chemical reaction when mineral elements come together in the soil. Depending upon that reaction chemically is going to determine how fast that electrical current is flowing. If it flows too fast, too acidic of a soil, then the plants can't pick up the nutrients because the nutrients are moving too quickly in that soil, and they will tend to leach into the soil deeper. If the soil pH is too alkaline or base, then that electrical current speed is too slow, and the nutrients will be lost to the plant, and they'll just seep into the earth and be lost to the plant and to the biology. If your plant cannot perform basic functions throughout the day, they'll not be able to create sugars that are beneficial to soil organisms. This is how plants, as a photosynthesis, creating those sugars, storing them in the roots, and then releasing that sugar in the soil to attract that biology. When the biology become attracted to it, they'll form symbiotic relationships with that plant, and it will be the biology that's primarily responsible for bringing those nutrients to the plant, because the plant rootlets get a very small percentage of nutrients all on their own. It's the biology that does the rest.
See, that's where you're talking about biology there. Now, typically, when people talk about soil biology, they focus a lot on if I'm growing woody plants and I'm growing trees, then I need a very fungal dominated soil. But if I'm growing vegetables and annuals and things like that, then I need a very bacterial dominated soil. Now, my personal view is yes, you need that is right at the extremes. But
Hmm.
if you want to create a more balanced, a more sustainable sort of ecosystem for your garden, where you can grow um, annuals under perennials, or you can intertwine, biennials or short-lived perennials with your annuals, then you need to create a habitat for both. So the way I'd think about it is that you need to create close to 50-50 in a vegetable garden, so you can create the right environment for both. Now, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I actually really like that. That's really brilliant. You want to be able, so actually you can modify it. You can take plants. Think of our guilds, right? What are our guilds? That's how we really want to be doing our planting, is within guilds, not monocropping or anything like that. Hey, I have one row of tomatoes, I have one row of asparagus. It's better to plant within your own guild. So, for example, the three sisters: corn, squash, zucchini. I'm sorry, beans. These are your three sisters. They're all on the same plant frequency or same guild. So they actually aid in nitrogen fixation. They aid in nutrient recycle, or the nutrient cycle. They aid in the carbon cycle, and the biology of the soil see that relationship. And so what's going to happen is fungal bacteria, for example, will latch onto the rootlets and begin to create something called white mycelium, which looks like a beautiful spider web in the soil. And it connects with each of the root systems of those plant guilds. This is a massive aid in the nutrient and carbon cycle of these plants, because now they have this, this fungal bacteria has a symbiotic relationship with this, say beans. Now, when that those beans through the fungal bacteria are going to be connected to the corn and the squash, and the level of nutrients is going to undergo adjustments to where it's going to benefit the plants, all the surrounding plants that the mycelium is connected to. And it's also going to connect them to water sources as well. It can also aid in water retention for these plants. So you can kind of think of like fungal bacteria as being the architects of the soil, is a very good way of describing them. And when that plant decomposes, we don't want to be pulling these plants that die. We don't want to be pulling them out of the soil and then composting them or throwing them away. What I would recommend is leave them there, because certain fungal groups will decompose that plant, like a tomato plant, for example, and take those nutrients and put it back into the soil on that same frequency or guild of the following crop. So if you're going to plant tomatoes, then you can do another round of tomatoes. Or if you had corn in that row, now you can do squash in that row, because it's going to stay on the same frequency. Those mineral nutrients will stay on the same frequency as the prior year.
See, uh, what you're touching on there a little bit is around crop rotation.
Yep.
And I'm still a believer in healthy crop rotation,
Yep.
but I mean, where you mentioned that you can grow tomatoes after tomatoes, if you've let the plants from one season to the next. Now, personally, um, I'm still one of those kind of people who think that okay, yes, you can build a nutrient level back to support another tomato plant, but if you look at some of the fungal diseases for tomatoes, you can start to get those overwintering in that soil. So it's good to move them to a slightly different patch, not in exactly the same spot. I mean, it doesn't have to be massively miles away different, but if you try and avoid exactly the same spot to plant them in again, that's sort of the basic crop rotation that I practice. Well, I don't know even if you call it crop rotation, but it's don't plant the same plant in the same spot for 2 years running. That's my mentality. But I do this other thing where I grow potatoes in wood chips. So I'll pile manure or compost or anything like that, and then plant my potatoes, and then I'll put at least a foot and a half of wood chips on top of it. And then after that year, I've harvested my wood chips. That bed has broken down, and then that bed is just used as a mulch for the next 3 or 4 years. So then I'll move on to the next bed and grow my potatoes there, and then I'll create some organic matter that is going to last me for that bed for the next 2, 3 or 4 years, and I'll move on to the next bed. And that's one of the little tricks that I've started using over the last few years. Now, what do you think about that sort of idea?
Well, two things come to mind. I hope everyone's taking notes because that actually is a very good system. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, you can take that same design, and if you're going to move it over. So if you have, like, for example, one row and you want to just let that heal for that year, move it over to another row, then you can prep that row specifically for that crop. Or if you're going to do the mixing of gills or the combination of gills, so you would have, again, corn, squash, zucchini, it's already set up. It's that preparation work is set for that row. That row had time to heal. It had time to build its biology. It's had time to recycle the nutrients and the carbon. So you plant there, now it's all set to go. You're going to have a lot less resistance and a lot less to worry about that year. And then you can just kind of repeat that process, kind of go back and forth. So everyone take notes, because that's actually good teaching right there. I like that.
All right, let's just say hello to a few people in the audience. I know you're being ignored a little bit tonight, so I do apologize for that. But we've got a very special guest on with us. So Phil, Frank, Biggie G, Brian from Allotment Life, Jerry Acklin's here. How are you all doing tonight? Thank you all very much for coming in. And if I have missed you, I do apologize. But let's try and milk some knowledge from our eminent guest tonight. So can you tell us about a little project that you've worked on? What you're actually something that you've practically done or you're doing?
Oh yeah. I got a couple. I'll tell you one thing. I'm specializing in growing plants outside of their region. So I had figured out how to grow coffee here in the States, for example. So I ordered up a coffee plant, and I was like, okay, well, I'm in North Houston, Texas. I've already spoken with some of the horticultural experts of my area, and they're telling me, hey, you can't grow coffee in Texas. Coffee doesn't grow in Texas. What are you talking about? So I had ordered up a plant from Colombia. And I started this little guy out in a pot at first until I could kind of build him up. Then I put him outside and started, treating that soil, getting the biology in that soil. And believe it or not, that coffee plant started to thrive. And I started telling some people about it, and they're like, "Wow, you have a coffee plant growing out in the woods in Houston, Texas?" I says, "Yeah." And there's a few other. I got like a pineapple that was growing up there. I took some pictures of the pineapple. I had people telling me you can't do that. I did some coconut as well. So when you the point is, when you understand how to really care for your soil in unique ways, you can break those boundaries. I'm actually working on next year writing a book called Breaking the Zones, and it's all about teaching you how to take plants from other parts of the world and grow them right in your backyard, no matter what the experts tell you.
Awesome. So you can, so for those of you that don't know Ian, I'm going to put a link into his Facebook page. You can get in contact with him there. But we've ignored you long enough, guys, and I do apologize for that. But I'm going to bring you guys in. So if anyone has any questions or comments, now's the time to make them, and we'll get Ian's thoughts on them and try and get you guys involved a little bit as well. Because you know me, I don't like leaving you guys out for very long. So Brian has mentioned that his granddad tried growing tomatoes in the same bed every year. He never really learned that the crop was poorer every year.
Yeah, so this is a fun one for me because I had this one gentleman who was going through the same thing. Every year, his tomato plants were in the exact same spot. And so he was telling me about his fertilization practices. And I said, well, we need to tweak how you fertilize. I ran some lab work on his soil. His soil, the pH was off. It needed to be 6.4. His was 7.4. So that was very bad for the soil, very bad for these plants. The electrical conductivity in the soil was too low. That electrical conductivity, by the way, that's energy. That's mineral energy. You're gonna be told by experts that all it is just a measurement of mineral salts. That's not true. It is actual energy. It has electrical currents that flow through it, and the plants need that energy. So if it's too low, it's going to impact the overall growth of your plant because all biological life needs energy. Without it, you have illness. Okay. So the best way to kind of counter that, for gardeners, there's a group called T&J Enterprises, who I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but they do a great job of forming organic, clean fertilizers. And I think this is important because a lot of the fertilizers, a lot of people, they go to the department store, right? And I'm going to go to my local department store, I'm going to buy this product. Well, those products never work because the balance of how to balance those nutrients isn't there. The knowledge isn't there. So look in your local area and really see who knows how to balance those nutrients really, really well if you're going to buy product. And furthermore, test your water. If your garden or hose water is heavy in chlorine, then you're going to have a very hard time growing because the chlorine acts as a natural bactericide. It will kill off that soil bacteria. So I highly encourage, I don't know what the laws are there, but I highly encourage you take the time to harvest water, rainwater, and use that as your watering source from now on, and you'll have a much greater result year after year.
See, what you're talking about there about water is I like using grey water quite a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, my grey water usage system isn't very sophisticated. It's literally a bucket outside my kitchen door. So we have a bowl in the sink, and that gets poured into a bucket. And then when that bucket gets full, we just pour it down on the garden. So it's not very sophisticated. I do want, when I get the time, I do want to build something that filters and takes out some of the nasties as well.
Yep.
I mean, especially in the summer, while a couple of years ago we had a really dry summer, and while our neighbours were, we had a hosepipe ban, so people weren't allowed to use hosepipes on the grass. My grass was lush because I was just pouring buckets of used kitchen water on it. So there's a comment from Jerry here. The nitrates a plant leaves in the soil must be considered also.
Yes, nitrates are very important. How do I say this? So your nitrates and your nitrogen levels, you can look at how your plant is processing that. Where your nitrate source is coming from is a good place to look first, because what happens in the soil is a very different chemical reaction than what happens in the plant itself. So if there are ways that you can actually test the nitrate levels in your leaves by simply extracting the juice from it and doing using a chemical reagent, you can see the response. And if the response is poor, then you can look back at that soil and say, okay, what's going on with the soil with these nitrate levels and the nitrogen levels?
Here's a nice one, a bit more personal. How did a Long Islander become so interested in gardening? Not exactly known for agriculture.
That's actually a phenomenal question. Um, because on the city, nobody cares, right? It's food is food. Wherever it comes from doesn't matter. Like no one wants to know how the sausage gets made, right? So the story on that is I was born in Long Island, New York, but at the age of 5, my parents took me up to the state of Maine. We lived in Maine for 7 years, and literally it was like culture shock because everything around me when I was a kid was my favorite pizza joints and the city. And then we go to Maine, and I have literally nothing around me except the world's largest coyotes and woods and farmland. And so, there was nothing to do. So you had to I spent most of my summers, learning how to ranch, how to work with horses, cattle, slaughter pigs, all of that stuff. And I loved it. And I've always enjoyed that quite a lot once I got into it. We went to North Carolina for 4 years, too many. And from there, I got to do a little bit of work, but it wasn't until I got into Houston. I was living in Houston, Texas. It wasn't until I got into Houston that I was really able to dive into the actual science behind growing and gardening. And that education really opened my eyes to what was happening on a global level. And, I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that fired me up to do what I do is what I saw, what my current country, Mr. James, I don't know where you are, but what American government is doing to our farmers makes me absolutely infuriated. And on top of the fact that I see what's happening to the Amazon forest, I thought, well, if they're willing to destroy the Amazon forest, how much more of this world are they going to go after?
Absolutely. Brian, as you mentioning, here we go. Grandad added horse manure or chicken manure, but it was never well rotted down enough. It was taking nitrogen from the soil to continue not rotting down. I guess one of the things about there as well is nitrogen that is quite fresh is not always plant available. I think it's not always. It's not. I mean, it brings us onto something that we were talking about just before this live, actually, where you can have things like nitrogen or things like phosphorus or potassium in abundant quantities, but plants will still be deficient of those minerals and those nutrients because they're not in a form that's plant available. And how do we turn that? Well, one of the things is, do we continue adding these chemicals when we need to? I mean, whether we're adding it in the form of synthetic or whether we're adding it in form of organic, do we continue supplementing these things, or do we try and do something else to get the plant to be able to take this up?
Great question. This is actually a pet peeve of mine because I've spoken with so many people that are like, oh, I'm going to put down, horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that, except what's your source? Because if you're getting like department store manures, then you're looking at a ton of additives, hormones, and chemicals, synthetics that are being thrown in those manures. They'll add it to the manure, but they're also coming straight from the animal themselves because, we don't know what's the source. Is it a clean source? How is that animal being cared for? What are they eating? And whatever the horse is eating or whatever the animal is eating, that's what's going to be in that manure. That's what's going into your garden and then gets into your food. Okay. So what I like to recommend is put those manures through a thermophobic composting process. It takes about 15 days. You're going to take a layer of fresh grass clippings and then your manure, whatever manure you're going to use, a layer of straw, then add some biochar, and then add you just repeat those layers until you feel as though you have a decent sized pile. Then you're going to tarp it. It's better to do this in like a metal, like a wired bin, because you're going to do this process, filling this bin up, and you're going to need to be able to let it compost for about 15 days. And you're going to cover it with like a tarp, you're going to let the temperature rise to about 140. Leave it at 140. If it gets any hotter than that, you need to start turning that pile. But every 5 days, you're going to turn that pile. And what's happening is it's going to, one, sterilize that compost of any dangerous pathogens and bad bacteria. And it's going to, two, massively increase the beneficial microbes that your soil needs. And that biochar, again, will act as like a home for this bacteria. So it's going to allow them to procreate much faster than if you didn't have it. Try to keep the moisture levels at 50% at all times, because if it gets too dry or too wet, it's going to go either anaerobic, or you're going to start killing off bacteria if it gets too dry. So this is what I would do with manures.
Frank's bringing in something that this is something that a lot of Brits do. We aerate the beds. We like our lawns, but I think a lot. Do you know, even in permaculture, I think lawns have a place. I think this cliche of grow food, not lawns. I think it is just that. It is a cliche, and I don't think it's fitting anymore. I mean, it might have been when all people had was lawns, but I'll give you my example. I mean, I have a lawn. It's probably a third of my garden, but I have small children. Now, with permaculture zoning, my vegetable and my food growing area should be close to the house, but it's not. My grazing area and my lawn is close to the house because I need to be able to see my children. I need to be able to keep an eye on them. And the food growing area is the furthest away from my house.
Mm-hmm.
It goes in completely opposite. The opposite zoning to what the permaculture sort of design would say. But it's something that has to work, because if I don't keep an eye on my children, then I don't know what they're up to, and then I'm not. Then it's causing me additional stress. So,
Yep.
But what Frank's talking about here is, that cracking the soil is something that a lot of people scarify the lawns during autumn, and they crack the soil. Especially now, it's important to do it because we're getting so much rain. I mean, it would have been good to do it before we got all this rain. It's going to be quite bad to do it right now while the ground is so sodden, I think. But once it starts drying up, it'll be important to do it again, because our winter's just going to be constant rain and wetness. Okay, so there's quite a few people mentioning about rainwater being the only source for some people. Do you know what an allotment is? Have you heard of an allotment before, Ian?
I'm familiar with the term, but
okay, allotment is it's basically a small piece of land that someone can rent for a very modest fee for a year. But on there, he or she can grow food for themselves.
mm-hmm.
And basically use it as a garden for themselves. So it's sort of like community gardening, but each person is designated an individual plot that they can then tend to. So not all of those have water sources. Some of them can only use whatever they can collect. So some of the guys that do pop in here are quite way. They've got loads of water boats, loads of IBC totes collecting water, so they're doing a lot of good stuff.
Good.
I mean, Laura mentions when she washes her car, she scrapes off the foam off the top, and waters the nearby plants with the rest. So it's another usage of grey water.
Yeah. It's not a bad idea, but you're going to want to add some biology. You can add, so if you have a water source and it has any kind of chemical base to it, you can add some biology to it to clean up the chemicals. Because if the plants get that in their root system, it's going to decrease their ability to pull in nutrients because it's a synthetic substance. So if you, like, for example, if you were to add molasses or yucca extract to that water source and let that sit for a little bit, the bacteria will actually encapsulate those chemical molecules, break them down, convert them to energy, and now it's going to benefit the plant. You just can't go too excessively with this. Otherwise, it will affect the plant's health and it can kill off the bacteria.
So Rodney's got a question here. Tap water run off into a tub. Won't the chlorine eventually evaporate off?
Yes and no. Yes and no. It really depends on how chlorinated that water is. Like, I'll give you an example. In Pearland, Texas, the chlorine ratio in that water is so severe that the pH comes out at what I measure. It was like an 8.2 was the water pH. I'd never seen that before. It was just that awful. So if you have water that's really, really alkaline and it's tap water, it's most likely high concentrations of chlorine. So what you want to do is you can bottle that stuff up, put it out in the sun, crack off the lid, and let the sun kind of purify, and that will significantly help. Another method, again, you can still add, and I highly recommend it, either yucca or molasses, because the bacteria will encapsulate that also. The bacteria's job is to clean up any synthetic or chemical-based fertilizers or substances and convert it into food energy for them and the plant. It's just too much of that stuff, and it's too toxic for even the bacteria to deal with.
I mean, sometimes aerating, if you've got a bucket of water with a lot of chlorine in as well. I mean, I used to keep fish. I used to keep a lot of tropical fish at home. And one of the tricks that we used was before we used tap water and add that to the fish tank. I mean, the chemical additives to get rid of the chlorines can get quite expensive. So what we used to do was to aerate the water quite a bit beforehand. So just have a bucket of water and stick what do you call it in it? One of those air stones.
Yeah, air pump.
Yeah, stick an air stone in and get lots of air into that soil, because the more agitated the water is, the faster that chlorine breaks down. So Hendrik's got a question here. Do chickens on compost bring addition to the soil? So Hendrik, I think, is referring to chicken manure.
So it's chicken manure bring addition to the soil. Yeah, I mean, it can build up the soil composition. That's going to be organic matter that's being added to the soil. So yeah, and it's very beneficial. But again, put that chicken manure through a composting process. You never, ever, ever want to lay raw chicken manure or raw manures in general on your plants. It's way too much energy for the plants. And if you've never seen a seed burn, try and plant it in like cow manure. You'll watch that seed light up like a Christmas tree.
See, this is one of the things that I hear a lot, right? But this is one of the things that my parents have done, and it's the thing that my grandparents have done, and all the way as far as we know, is where they keep in Bangladesh, they normally have every house will have at least one cow. It'll probably be a cow rather than a bull, because that cow is going to be the milk source, or that cow is going to be the way they're going to carry materials, or they're going to use that to plow the fields. And what they'll do is they'll have a pit where they just gather all the manure. Now, some of that can be fresh, some of that can be quite rotten, but it's just a pit of manure. But they'll take that and they'll use that. They won't compost it. They'll take it every few months and just take a pile of it, and they'll grow pumpkins in it. They'll grow, especially jackfruit. Jackfruit and mango trees. They'll take fresh manure straight out of that pit, pop a mango seed in it, pop a jackfruit seed in it, and they can grow fresh trees. And it's one of the things that I hear a lot in, sort of from a Western perspective, that fresh manure can be bad. But I think fresh manure can be bad if it's not used correctly.
Yeah, and I think, well, the best way to test, because this is what I generally tell, because I do have people that pitch ideas to me, and I love that. pick yourself up a what I call, or what's called a refractometer. And so this is kind of like a soil experiment, because the problem in America is that this manure, they're not coming from clean sources. So we're getting a bunch of synthetics and chemicals and hormones and additives. Well, this is going to spike that electrical conductivity. It's going to spike the erg in that manure. So I've never really had any success with it, but outside of composting. But you get a refractometer, and from there you can try this experiment, grow the plant to full maturity, take the juices of that plant, put it on the refractometer, look through it. If the Brix percentage, like if we're doing this for tomatoes, for example, there's 5 different ranges on the Brix scale. There's poor, average, good, excellent, and disease-free. Okay. Most everything we buy in the grocery store today is between the poor and average range. Organic or conventional makes no difference. In fact, with my lab work, organic always tends to come out lower than conventional, the ones that are using GMOs and pesticides and all that. So with a tomato plant, you're looking at 4% is poor, 6% is average, 10% is good, and 14% is excellent. So if you take that refractometer, you grow using that fresh manure. If you come out at a high Brix, then you know that manure method was spot on. And it's something you want to replicate and then later modify as time goes on, because the objective is to always get a higher and higher Brix in our plants. And again, that's the Brix that's the sugar in the plant sap that carries all the vital mineral nutrients that keep the plant healthy and keep you healthy.
See, we've got another comment here. I find using nettle and comfrey tea better than chemical liquid manure. What are your thoughts on that?
So I like let's see, Barker. I like that last name. I like that a lot. I like where you're going with this. Natural sources for fertilization. So here's what I would do. Again, the objective is you want to be able to, if you're using comfrey, for example, as some type of fertilizer, comfrey is a perennial. Comfrey is really wonderful for plants in general that you're growing. But if the comfrey has a low Brix or low sugar content, then when you add it as a fertilizer, it's not going to have nearly as much as an effect on the plant as it would, say manures that are composted. And the reason for that is because Dr. Reams taught that plants don't live off of the fertilizers we give them. They live off of the energy from the fertilizers we give them. Well, that's mineral energy. We know this makes sense because all, like your leaves, for example, are comprised of 84 different minerals. If one of those minerals are lacking or in short supply, your respiratory system will either shut down or you will be susceptible to all kinds of upper respiratory diseases. Right? So it's minerals that sustain our lives. It's minerals that sustain all biological life on its frequency. I won't go too deep into that, but just understand that if the mineral composition is lacking in what we're using as a fertilizer, then it's going to have a negative impact on our plants that we're trying to grow at high Brix. And that's really the objective to everything we do, is we get high Brix produce. When that happens, then you know that what you did works versus something that didn't work.
So Isabel's got a question on what biochar is.
So biochar is wood that goes through like a kiln process. Basically, and you can actually build this. You can actually build it. You get 2 metal planks, if you would, or posts, and put them at an angle to design like a pyramid. And you let the wood burn down overnight until it turns into this glassy, almost a glassy-like substance. When you pick up 2 pieces of wood and it cracks and it sounds like it's glass breaking, that's perfect biochar. So biochar is a molecular process that wood undergoes through the process of heating or cooking underneath the fire. You can look in your local area and see who's buying or who's selling it, and then you can add it to your garden. Typically, companies are selling biochar in bags and it's like a fine dust. There's nothing wrong with that. It's still just as good as if you had the larger pieces. You can go either way with it. But just know that if you're going to get like a powder or a granule, it goes a very long way. So a little is a lot with this stuff.
See, I think one of the key differences between biochar and ordinary charcoal, I think charcoal would be good if you didn't have biochar.
Yeah.
But the difference is that biochar is it's a lot more stable in its form of carbon, and it, basically because it doesn't contain as much of the oils as the charcoal does. Because the purpose of charcoal is to create a fuel that you can use later on, whereas with biochar you're trying to burn those oils off, but maintain that carbon structure.
Yes, and the biochar has a unique ability to absorb toxins in the soil to help clean it up, whereas charcoal doesn't have as much of the ability to do it because it hadn't completed its chemical processing.
Yeah, see, that's one of the things that, you know, like with if you ever see activated carbon is very similar to biochar.
Yeah.
Isabel, just to mention, I've got a video on biochar. I mean, for a long time, I was a big skeptic on using biochar. The research that my brother did, well, the research that my brother did started to, open me up to the idea of using biochar. And then he said, okay, right, biochar's good. I'm going to convince you. So he dug a little pit. He didn't go as sophisticated as building this upside down pyramid. I mean, he went with a hole in the ground, a square hole in the ground, about 2 foot deep. He lit the fire at the bottom, laid the wood on top, and then covered the pit. He sealed it with soil and just left it open. We came back the next morning and we had beautiful biochar. I mean, I've got a video on the results of that. So if you want to have a look at that, please go ahead and have a look. Hendrik, I think they're missing being on the live today as well. So little Zaki was talking about Frank all day, actually. Normally by this point, my children have invaded the live stream and they've taken over and they're giving their commentary and improvs. But today's a little bit different. We're being a little bit more disciplined today. So let's see who else. What other comments have we got?
You are not doing them.
Can you pass my glasses, please? Here's an interesting comment. Just get Berkey water. Berkey water filter. I've never heard of a Berkey water filter.
Pause the slide.
So I've never heard of them either, and you know, here's what I can say about water filters, because I've gone through several of them. I've run a lot of lab tests on different companies. A lot of what I see is they're going to tell you, hey, we have carbon activated filters that help to filter out all the heavy metals, the mercuries, the leads, and the chemicals, right? Okay, that's great. The only thing is that should reflect in the tests. So if you're doing a pH test and a conductivity or electrical conductivity test on the water, then you should see the difference in that water. So if your water, for example, without the filter we'll say, has electrical conductivity of 300 ergs, and your pH comes out at, we'll say 7.6, then when the filter is on and you run that test, the pH should drop and the electrical conductivity should drop also. If it doesn't, your filter's not working.
Okay, here's a little one. Here's a nice comment. Tanya is based out she's in the southern hemisphere, so they're well into their season at the moment. So just off the subject a little, we're having a really wet spring. Sort it out in a little bit. And my garlic has just been hit by rust, and only a few weeks until harvest. Do I need to treat the soil, or and how without harming good fungi?
Very good question. One of the best ingredients to help the soil as well as fight back the fungal bacteria eating the plant, molasses or yucca. I love this stuff because you can use it for a lot of different things, right? You can actually turn this into a spray. You can add the molasses or yucca in a water spray, preferably rainwater or steam distilled water if you can get steam distilled. Mix it up. You would want to do a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons to a gallon of water. Mix it up and spray that on the plant. It will help in the plant in aiding it in bringing in more nutrients. It will help to repair the plant, and it will help to fight back the fungal bacteria, because what the bacteria in molasses and yucca will do is they will actually eat that fungal bacteria and ward it off. You can pour this stuff in the soil, and it will help to kind of balance out that soil food web a little bit, because fungal dominant soils is a good thing, but yeah, you're working with seeds that are low Brix to begin with. So I kind of want to answer this too with a second half. This is not your fault. This is not because you're a bad gardener. The biggest obstacle that all gardeners and farmers are facing today is the seed manufacturing industry. The seed manufacturing industry puts seeds through so many processes that it completely depletes that seed of vitality. And so when you're growing plants, it's harder to raise a high Brix plant from a low Brix seed in soil that still needs mending and healing. So the reason that the fungal bacteria are eating the plant is because literally that plant is coming apart on its biological frequency due to a lack of mineral composition in the soil, on top of the fact that this seed had been washed so many times by the manufacturer that the plant is having a very difficult time sustaining its own life. The job of fungal bacteria is to return nature back to the soil. So it's going to go after the garlic and break it down and put it back in the soil so it can aid in the development of new garlic that's coming up or any other nearby plants, including our favorite, weeds.
I mean, one of the other things about rust in itself, I mean, Frank's mentioned it down there, that it can be quite it's an airborne disease. It can winter in soils. I mean, that's why one of the advices in Britain has always been to burn any garlic leaves once it appears. But I mean, what I always do with rust is, if I do get, I mean, I get garlic rust quite badly.
Yeah.
I always take the leaves. Do you know, as soon as I see the first sign of it appear, that leaf is coming straight off. So whenever I spot a leaf with garlic rust on it, that leaf is coming off. So it just gives me days, rather than it's going to be inevitable when the whole plants turn yellow because of rust. But it just gives me a few more days each time when I'm just trimming those few leaves off. It's just giving me that. It's just allowing me to stretch to that finish line. Yeah, but we need to get to a point where we're not where we can fight. The soil can do a lot of the fighting, and the plant can do a lot of the fighting itself. Because I agree, some of the when plants are being affected, they are often being affected because they're weak plants.
Yep.
Even though they might look really healthy and really strong.
Yeah, that's very true. And so this is one of the biggest things that I encourage, I'll always look to become your own soil scientist, because garden variety books aren't going to help you, because they don't know. I'm not trying to be insulting. They genuinely do not know what they're talking about. And that's because they don't have quite the sophisticated education that, like, say, a soil scientist would have, or this gentleman here, Martin, that I'm with tonight. This is knowledge comes with a lot of experimentation, and it comes with taking the time to learn about our soils, how they act, how our plants are going to act to that soil. So do the lab work. for that soil. What's your pH? What's the electrical conductivity? Then we can look into how you can fix it, because really once you start increasing this is the magic. When the bricks of the plant is increased, it doesn't matter what disease has winterized in that soil. It cannot affect the plant. It won't. It will leave the plant alone, because the disease has to find a host. But if the host is in good health, then it's too much energy for it to invade. And so what will happen is that the biology in the soil will actually encapsulate that root, and it will protect the plant from outside invaders that would look to cause damage to that plant. Anything that's airborne that can get into like the cambium layer of the plant where the cells are, if those cells are in perfect health, then they cannot infect the cell, and therefore the disease cannot run rampant. The plant will take care of it on its own by sending sugar to that area, and through its root system creating new cells at high energy volume to replace the cells that are being affected, and eventually that disease dies off because it can't dominate its host.
So drop, there's no kids in today. We're just trying to be a little bit disciplined. We'll be back to normal with our live streams next week, and they'll be running rampant, so don't worry about that. Isabel's saying, do we have biochar in Europe? There are places that do sell biochar. You should be able to get it online quite easily, but I'd recommend it yourself. It's not difficult at all. So here we go. Here's an interesting one. What about David Good no compost rules? Meat, fish, all one can live. Again, however, there are no test results. See, Henrik, I've always been of the opinion that you should compost anything. Anything goes. I mean, you might want to treat things differently. Like with my kitchen scraps, I don't add them to my regular compost bin because I like to feed them to my worms. I like to use with cardboard and kitchen scraps. I specifically like to save them for my worms to eat. Manure, I like to add to my hotbeds so I can heat my greenhouse over winter. And wood chips that go straight onto the bed, whether it's raw, whether it's old, whether it's regardless of what state it's in, it's ready to go straight onto my growing beds. And anything else that I have, that gets composted.
Yeah, so the rules on compost, most anything goes. It just I agree. It really depends on what you're using it for. Like for example, if you're going to use kitchen scraps for citrus trees, right? Then you're not going to want to add, or I should say, what you are going to want to add are primarily like leafy greens, because they're rich in nitrogen and they tend to be richer in mineral composition. And you can put it through the compost process. You can also add citrus peels because you're going to be dealing with citrus trees. However, take that same scenario. Now you want to apply that to your actual garden bed. Bad idea, because when you start adding things like garlic, onion, and citrus from your kitchen scraps to your garden bed, it's going to drive certain biology away. Like earthworms, for example. Earthworms do not like garlic or anything citrus or onions. It's a massive deterrent for them. And so it really comes down to strategy and how you're going to use that compost for what project.
See, I'm gonna pick a little disagreement with you there.
Okay.
See, do you know, I mean, in our diet, we have a lot of onions. So a lot of onions, a lot of garlic in our diet. So probably about 30% of our kitchen scraps are onion peels or garlic peels or some kind of allium. That I have no issue at all putting that straight into my worm bin, and my worms will. I've put some pictures up on our Facebook group where my worms are all over those onions. I mean, some commented that it was the sulfur that's bad for them or it's irritable for them, but I mean, yes, the sulfur might raise the pH, and I might end up with some pot worms and other little things like that. But they're all doing the same job for me.
Right. So the impact it has on the worms is harder on their digestive system. And as a result, if it's impacting their digestive system, it's going to impact the overall health. Once you impact the overall health, then all the worm castings that come up from it won't have as much of an effect for them as if they were eating from their own diet. Because again, we want to just solely mimic nature in everything that we do. And so if it's not they'll eat it, but if it's not naturally seen for them to eat it, then it's not a natural part of their diet. And that's going to impact their overall health as a whole. And then that will impact their castings. But it's an interesting experiment. I like where you're going with that.
We're getting a few requests for Zaki to pop in. So is asleep? Oh, Zaki's asleep, Frank. But no, not tonight, mate. Next week. Just you can quickly come and say hello if you want.
Hi. Well, I gotta do
it. See, they're by this time they've normally taken over and the live stream is completely in their hands, and it's a little bit of a break from that. So here's one. If I can't get biochar, can I use the ash from my from the fireplace in the house once I've burnt the logs from my trees in my garden? Do you want to say hello?
I wouldn't, because ash doesn't have nearly as much nutrients as people think. You can get potassium or potash from it, but frankly, it doesn't have it stays in the soil for such a short period of time before it's gone, and the plants don't use too much of it. There are, Martin has his videos on how to make biochar. I've seen the video actually, and I strongly recommend that you do make your own biochar. Watch that video. There are also others out there that do teach you how to do it. So if you need multiple sources, YouTube is great, but definitely there's a huge advantage in learning how to make your own biochar if you can't get it from your local markets or online markets, because ash won't have the same effect.
I mean, there are with ash, there are lots of really good uses of ash in the garden. I mean, ash is an absolutely brilliant insecticide. So if you're getting things, because it's really alkaline. So if you have chickens and you have mites, adding it to their dust baths, adding it to their beddings. If you have green fly, just using it like a dusting for the plants, that's really good as well. Sprinkling it on the surface is good for keeping slugs under control. So it does have some really, really good benefits in the garden as well. If it's not so rather than just thinking of it as a source of nutrients, you can use it for other sources. I mean, Laura, if you can't get biochar, we have this thing called lumpwood charcoal. They sell it for barbecues, and it's pretty much charcoal, but it's not the briquettes, and it's not treated with any. Try and get the one that's not treated with any petrochemicals. And you can use that lumpwood charcoal as a substitute. I mean, it's not as good, but it's better than not. Let's see. Here's one. Would the charcoal in my fish filters benefit the soil?
If you're using I don't think I understand this. If you're using the charcoal to like filter, yeah.
I mean, that charcoal, it's like activated carbon, so it's it's very similar to biochar, so it has that really porous structure. Right, guys, we've passed our 1 hour mark by quite a bit. We're about 10 minutes past our 1 hour mark. So I'm going to quickly try and fly through because I don't want to drain our guests too much. Let's see. Before we call it a day, let's see. Okay, we're not far from the end. Guys, I think we should call it a day there, because Ian, I'd love to have you back on the live, maybe in the spring sometime, if you're up for that.
I'd be honored.
It'd be good to have you. Frank says hello to you.
Yes.
But yeah. But on that note, thanks everyone for coming in and joining us. Really appreciate your watching, and I'll see you next week. So take it. Bye from us all.